So today we are closing out the four cardinal virtues by bringing us into the virtue of temperance. Now, the virtue of temperance is very interesting, right? It's a virtue that moderates the attraction towards sense pleasures, especially the pleasures of the palate and the flesh, and keeps them within the proper limits of reason. Now, basically, what the definition of this is to say, it keeps us from actually being bound to the things of this world. And the virtue of temperance actually allows us to choose what we engage in this world and what we don't, rather than to be kind of controlled like an animal going to whatever thing kind of comes our way. The temperate person does nothing for the sake of delight alone, but rather because something is ordered to the good, then they go and pursue it. For example, right, the temperate person may have a couple of cups of coffee a day, but it's not just because they need their caffeine fix or they're addicted to coffee, but it could be because they're meeting with people and they're having a coffee meeting, or the same thing around food or things like this. Is the temperate person is always engaging the things of the flesh in right reason, what serves charity and what makes the most amount of sense with the particular situation in one's lives. Often intemperance, which is the vice on the opposite side, manifests itself with such statements as this: I couldn't control myself. I just had to have that fifth cookie. Which is actually brutal for pastors during Christmas time, because everyone makes like their best Christmas cookies and shares it with the pastor. And you got to try at least every one of them just to make sure that they're, amazing. And it's amazing because after you've eaten so many, you realize I don't feel well because I was not intemperate. It wasn't with right reason that I was trying and sampling every single cookie that came across my desk. Here's another example of intemperance. I don't know what happened. I just had too much to drink. I had one beer, and then someone brought another beer, and I was like, oh, this is really good. And then I had another cocktail, and then it was like, oh man, it's too late. Point of no return. Or here's another one. I was just sitting next to my girlfriend watching a movie late at night, and all of a sudden, we just kind of went too far. Again, these are all examples of not possessing the virtue of temperance. It's a virtue to recall that it brings us into the means of what is actually in the middle, not the excess, not the deficiency. And middle means that passions, right, they actually have their role. They're not all bad. We are not teetotalers. We don't shun all of the passions. We're not like this stoic that has no emotional feel to it. But actually the emotions and temperance especially, they give us good information of how to engage the world around us. God, when he created us and in the Garden of Eden, he made all of these things and he said they're good. And a lot of those things actually brought delight to the senses. Like, can you imagine, right, Adam and Eve going and having some of the produce of the Garden of Eden and just really delighting in it? But they never would have eaten too much, nor would they have eaten too little. They had just what they need when they needed it. They were never controlled by their passions, and likewise, the temperate person is also free in regards to their passions. Now, temperance is difficult to navigate because it varies so much per person. So like the virtue of justice, it's a lot more clear cut, right? Is you look at a situation and you say, okay, you took $20, you owe me $20. It's just very clear. It's something you can kind of weigh. With temperance, there's a lot of the internal passions that are going on that make from one person to the next person very subjective. Like, for example, right, if I'm a marathon runner, I'm probably going to need to eat before I go running a lot of carbs. So I may have or even after I run, carb load. So I mean, I could have a couple plates of pasta, a couple bowls of cereal, and it actually wouldn't be intemperate if I was training for something. However, if it's just Saturday morning and I'm gorging an entire box of cereal, I have no plans to work out, that would be an example of intemperance. So it has to be based in right reason. Now, the difficulty in finding a proper medium or middle way with temperance is that the situation requires us to reevaluate what is temperate in every given situation. There isn't a blanket statement on how temperance works. it's judged in particulars. Now, because of this reality, right, it's actually a really hard virtue to obtain. Because it's a lot easier, right, to say, okay, I'm just going to stay away from everything completely, or just to say, I don't really care, I'm going to do what I want when I want to. It's hard to actually say, I'm going to govern by right reason. This is why in Dante, he writes the Dante's comedy. So you got Inferno, Purgatorio, Paradiso, and Dante has multiple levels of hell. But in one of the least penitential or least suffering realms of hell are those who have been condemned to hell because of sins of passion. Because what Dante is saying is the person who's struggling with intemperance isn't always consciously malicious and evil. They're oftentimes just very weak. But we have to realize as human beings, even though it may be hard to judge the situation on if something is a good passion to pursue or to avoid, we have to use that right reason because we're not animals, right? The animal kingdom, they're governed solely by the passions. This is where you'll see in a lot of experiments, right? Is the mice or the other, whatever creature it is that you're trying to test will always go towards the thing that is pleasurable, no matter what the consequence is. Temperance is not a virtue that we can say, oh, I have it, once and done. It's going to be always repeated. So now when using right reason to discern how much of a passion or pleasure to indulge in, St. Thomas Aquinas gives these beautiful standards. There's two of them. He says, first, ask yourself, is this something that I need? Again, this is bringing us back into right reason. When I have a smorgasbord of cookies before me, I can ask myself, is this something that you really need right now? Typically the answer would be no. But if it's yes, right, then it frees us up to engage with right reason and to pursue a passion. The second thing that Aquinas says is ask if it is something that will make you a more fit Christian witness. So again, going back to the example of the coffee, right, is it going to help me be a more effective witness? Is if these people are here, I'm meeting with them, then I have the next meeting, and we're sharing a cup of coffee together. Is that going to help the person to come to ease and to actually know Christ better? Or let's say, right, I'm not a big fan of beer or something like that. It's not true. Love craft beer. But let's say I'm not a fan of beer. I'm not, an addict or anything like that. I just don't really like it. But one of my, acquaintances really wants to go and meet at a brewery. Out of charity, I would probably indulge in a beer to serve the other brother or sister in Christ. What Aquinas beautifully illustrates is the ordered human experience. We do not just fill our needs, but we actually evaluate to see, okay, is this something that's going to glorify God? So it's actually possible in the Christian life to even fulfill not just a need, but a want. Something that we actually just kind of really would like to have, as long as it brings us and lifts us up to God. Now this is huge, because it shows that the church does not teach that the body is evil, and that it's just totally depraved. The church holds that it is to be, the body and the passions are to be engaged through right reason. So here's how we actually would grow in this virtue to obtain this middle way. The best way that one begins to integrate the virtue of temperance into their lives is to make what the tradition has called a rule of life. Now, this may sound very strange, but actually if you start to read the biographies from the lives of the saints, you'll see that almost every single saint in our tradition has some sort of a rule of life that they abide by. Now, this is not just they thought about this in the morning, or maybe the night before they made a bad choice and so they're tomorrow I'm going to be a lot better. Actually, what this rule of life is, it's something that's stable. So no matter what the circumstance is, they're going to continue to engage it. So here's a couple examples that I've come across in my own work of spiritual direction for a rule of life. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, someone wouldn't have any condiments on their stuff. So if they had a salad, no dressing. Hamburger, no ketchup. If they had fries, no mayonnaise. Just in case you're a little European. And so just by not putting salt and pepper on something, it constantly makes us deny our passions and to think with right reason. So what we would do in order to compose a rule of life would simply just to be to grab a piece of paper and just to put the days of the week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, all the way through Sunday. And then just to say, okay, on Wednesdays, I'm just not going to drink anything except for water. and then just to start to abide by it to get your passions in check. Another one that I came across that I really liked was no music except for on Sundays. So like someone who really loved to engage music. Or another one is no snacking between meals on Fridays and Wednesdays. I thought that was another really cool one. So now a rule of life is not like a mini type of Lent. It's actually something that you would do perpetually to keep your passions in check so that you're free when something does pop up. It's not like these passions are just driving you into a decision, but you actually get to sit back and say, do I really need this? I don't need it, but I think I'm going to have a piece. Now, I promise you that this will work. And I experienced this actually firsthand in seminary. There was an upperclassman, he said, he goes, Nate, I have mastered purity. And I'm like, cool, how'd you do it? And he said, I stopped eating candy. I was like, are you kidding me? That's how you solved any sort of issues with purity? And what he said so beautifully is he said, Nate, he goes, as I say no to sweets across the board and just don't eat them at all, it's amazing how easy it is to keep that own passion towards impurity in check. And it's brilliant wisdom, because if we can actually, because temperance is a virtue, if we're able to be temperate in one area of life, sweets, it's actually easy to slide that virtue into other areas that we may have more problems with. This is why there's a famous Catholic program called Exodus 90 that a lot of people do, not just in Lent, but throughout the entire year. And it gives people a rule of life so that they're actually constantly kind of putting their passions in right order. And to hear the testimonials of the men who have done this has been absolutely incredible. Just feel free to Google it. Exodus 90 is the program. St. Thomas Aquinas also adds that one who is pursuing a life of temperance also needs to pursue two other virtues. Now, the first one, I guarantee you have never heard before, because I didn't even know it was a virtue when I first heard it. It's called shamefacedness. That's a virtue. The other virtue is honesty. And here's why these two things are so important for growing in temperance. The reason why he says this is because if one is shamefaced, it means that they are horrified by base actions. So actions without reason. Like anytime that we would look more like an animal than a human being, we would be just horrified. The person who fears public scandal because of intemperate actions is less likely to commit grave vices. So if they're kind of in their mind like, man, I don't want to be that person at the party who's in the corner like just shoving my face full of stuff. Or I don't want to be that person who goes to, the grad party and I'm just over drinking and I'm starting to slur my speech and it's horribly embarrassing. So shamefacedness actually keeps us at times from making intemperate decisions because we're engaging right reason and being like, I don't want to make a fool of myself. Now, the virtue of honesty is something that I think is totally underestimated in regards to temperance. And here's why. We have to honestly admit when we are too attached to a particular thing. And I think oftentimes we human beings do a marvelous job of justifying things for ourselves. So, right, we say like, oh, I'm not really attached to that. I just really enjoy it, or, I didn't really have that much. It was just maybe a little more than what they had, but it wasn't too bad. And so without that radical honesty of just saying, you know what, I didn't need that extra helping. Or you know what, I didn't need to binge Netflix shows 2 weeks in a row. Or you know what, I didn't need to actually take that much sleep last night, and now I'm kind of lethargic because of it. Honesty allows us to kind of stop and evaluate how we're actually moving in the life of virtue. Now, St. Augustine is quoted, and this goes to the honesty point. Early on in his conversion, he said, Lord, give me chastity, but not quite yet. And eventually, right, in Augustine's life, he actually obtained the virtue of chastity because he was able to be honest with himself. He's like, I still really like the pleasures of the flesh, and I'm not ready to give them up, but Lord, please do help me move towards that way, because right now I really don't feel like getting rid of them. This radical honesty of Augustine is what allowed him to move towards virtue. Lord, give me chastity, but not quite yet. Now, we do not serve ourselves when we pretend that we are not driven by our passions. So here's a prime example. Almost every single Lent, I will give up kind of sweets. However, every single Lent, McDonald's releases their Shamrock Shake, which is literally my favorite shake. I mean, it's like pure corn syrup. It is so unhealthy for you. But I just love how it tastes. And so as Lent is going on, and I know it's going to happen every single Lent, I'm starting to like think about the Shamrock Shake. And then like I notice it when I'm driving by somewhere, Shamrock Shakes at McDonald's. And I'm like, oh man, it's only going to be for a limited time. I gotta have one. And then I'm celebrating minor feast days like, oh yeah, I really like St. Hubert. He's one of my favorite saints. Just pray to him every single day. And it's his feast day. I really should have a Shamrock Shake to celebrate him. Well, in all these examples, right, I'm trying to deceive myself. But at the core of it, right, is I'm actually quite attached to this one thing. It's like, Nate, come on, you literally have every single day that you can go to Culver's and get a mint shake anytime you want, right? And not only that, but you know full well that even after Lent is done, they're still serving Shamrock Shakes. However, that lack of honesty with myself just still kind of puts the blinders on, and I drive forward with intemperate decisions. Now, there are certain friends of temperance. One we've already actually kind of met, that virtue of chastity falls underneath the virtue of temperance. I remember Father Richards, when I was assigned with him in St. Michael, he had just come back to the rectory, and some beautiful father had asked Father Richards to bless a chastity ring for his daughter and his son. And so Father Richards blessed the rings, and he came back and he said, the funny thing is, I hope they don't think that once they're married, they don't have to be chaste. Because even in marriage, you have to be chaste. You have to live chastely. And so chastity is a virtue that we actually need throughout our entire life. Both when we're with our spouse, to know that that is the delight of my heart. And I'm not looking anywhere else for sensual delights. Not only that, but even in my spouse, I would never treat them as an object, but as someone I'm truly wanting to give myself with complete freedom and right reason. Now, there are degrees of chastity. The first degree of chastity is refraining from consenting to lustful thoughts. And this is something that, my heart goes out to the penitent who may just be bombarded, right, with some sort of temptations, especially in the summer months when people are lightly clad. And they're just really devastated inside their heart. Like, I can't get rid of these thoughts. And it's just important for us to say, okay, so how deep did those thoughts go into our hearts? I mean, if it didn't go into our heart very deep and it's just a passing thought, that actually fits more of the category of an observation rather than the sin of lust. So even though it doesn't feel great, it probably isn't actually always an affront against chastity. Secondly, if we wanted to grow in chastity, we want to the expulsion of any impure thoughts. So if we start to say oh, there's someone that's very beautiful, and then we start to think about it after they're already gone, then we have to say, oh, I gotta stop. The person's gone. I'm moving more into the realm of fantasy and objectification. And this is how we move again against the vice of lust. Third, one possesses a great calm in regards to sexual things. Now this is something that actually a priest was giving a talk to us young clergy. And he said, in the battle for chastity, what it's very important is to be like a tree in the middle of a storm. So if a tree, right, in the middle of a storm and the wind is blowing super hard and it remains just very rigid, eventually that wind is going to hit the tree and it's going to snap in half. However, if the tree can just kind of move and ebb and flow and bend with the wind, it'll stay rooted. And this priest said this is exactly how we should engage when there's kind of a lustful temptation that goes. Don't lose your peace. Don't totally freak out. Just kind of let it pass through. Don't over-relate to it. And eventually you'll come right back into the center. The more rigidity that we have and the more anxiety that we drive up, oftentimes the worse the temptation towards unchastity would be. St. Catherine of Siena, actually, in her life, has this incredibly beautiful testimony about it. She wrote in her journal she was just bombarded by sexual temptation. It was just tormenting her. And so she cried out, she goes, Lord, why won't you get rid of these things? I'm so disgusting. I can't believe I'm having these thoughts. And finally the Lord appeared to her and said, Catherine, how does your heart feel about this? And Catherine responded, I hated it. I hated every moment of those intrusive thoughts. And the Lord said, the reason you hated it is because your heart is anchored in me, not in that vice. Even though it was a terrible temptation, your heart did not fall to unchastity. Possessing the virtue of chastity, or being temperate in regards to sexual things, is not being asexual, having no sexual drive. It is not allowing sex to decide how we think and act, but rather to place it back in right reason. Now, another actual virtue or a friend of temperance is the virtue of humility. Now, this is interesting, right? Humility falls underneath temperance. And here's why. Aquinas says that humility has to do with seeing oneself correctly in relationship to others. So it's like a temperate amount of drinking oneself. They're not drunk on themselves to the point that their, ego gets super huge and inflated. They don't hate themselves and saying like, oh, I'm a piece of trash. I've got no self-esteem. It's just the right amount. Now, the best definition that I've ever come across in regards to humility is actually humility is truth. Humility is truth. And so actually, if we're truly being humble in life, we're actually having this remarkable honesty about things. So the humble person, right? Let's say they did an amazing job at something and you praise them, right? The humble person would be able to say, well, thank you very much. I worked very hard on that. I appreciate your comments. It doesn't inflate their ego. And they're also not retreating into this place of, like, oh, I'm just terrible. I'm a worm. I'm no good. So humility moderates the amount that we're drinking in our own ego. Humility also allows a person to grow in self-awareness. They realize who they are in relationship to God and to others. The humble person is the unassuming person. And this is oftentimes when we were pointing at a humble person, it's the person that doesn't have like this air of ego about them, but they're just kind of like, oh yeah, sure, that was interesting, that was cool. And the same thing in regards to God, right, is they know who God is and they know who they themselves are. So they're not going to try to do things that only God can do, but they're also going to, in humility, realize when they can't do something, just to say, hey God, I can't, you can, and you promised. The humble person is able to recognize their faults without falling into like shame and self-hatred. They will say, you know what, you're right, Lord, I really messed up on that. I wish I would have done better. Versus what oftentimes happens to the non-humble person is they just spiral into this sense of shame and they lock themselves in and all they think about is themselves and their bad choices. Rather than just to humbly say, yeah, I'm really broken and I need some help. So please, Lord, will you forgive my sins? Now, another friend of temperance, and this is a great virtue that I think very few of us actually are familiar with. Not because we don't possess it, but we don't use the verbiage. It's the virtue of meekness. Meekness. And this is the best definition of meekness I've ever come across. It was from Father Bill Baer. He said, meekness is controlled strength. Meekness is controlled strength. So if one possesses the virtue of meekness, they're not about flaunting the power that they have or lording it over them, but rather they know what power they have and they simply use it to serve. This is why Christ can say to his disciples, come to me, all you who are tired and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, because I am meek and humble of heart. Now, if there is anyone who was ever meek in this world, it was Jesus. Largely because this guy's the Son of God. He created everything. He could have been going through his passion and been like, uncreate you, lightning bolts from heaven on you. And yet he had this control of strength. He's like, yeah, I could have the angels come and rescue me, but I'm not going to. It's okay. So the meek person is someone who's able to say, yeah, you know what? I could probably run intellectual circles around you, or I could probably lord my power and authority over you, but I'm not going to, because it's unnecessary. Again, you see this virtue of temperance moderating meekness, to say how much of my power or authority am I going to use, And it's all based on right reason. Is it warranted in the situation? Is it not? There are times, right, where Christ did use his power, right? When he was, during the Passion, he said, they came out and said, who are you the one that we're looking for? And he says, I am. And he speaks the name of God and they all fall backwards because it was just such a powerful thing. Or when he rose from the dead and the stone cracked and the guards fell on their backs. So there are moments where he did exercise power, but it was always for the purpose of right reason. A person who is meek is someone that possesses themselves. They don't need to give a show of power because it doesn't matter if people see it or not. They just simply are. And this is why, again, Christ is the model of meekness, is he didn't need people to know that he was powerful. He just said, I am the Son of God. And that was enough. Now, after seeing some of the friends of temperance, let's go to some of the vices. So the vices of temperance fall in two categories, right? Obviously, the one we know of intemperance. And intemperance is basically someone who is emotionally stunted and not developed properly. Now, this is based on a psychological principle. And this is what's so fascinating, right? The person who's intemperate isn't able to engage the passions with right reason. And so they're just totally on the winds. They're like a horse connected to a chariot. Wherever the horse wants to go, they fly off with it. What they've done in studies for people who struggle with addictions, whether that's gambling, food, sex, alcohol, drugs, is they've noticed the age when they started to use their substance that they were addicted to, intemperate towards, is oftentimes the time in their life when they stopped growing emotionally. So what they would call it as an emotional retardation of the mind. So this is why, right, is you can have someone who'd been addicted since they were a young child, and even in their 30s or 40s, they're still acting like a 14-year-old. Because, see, what intemperance does is it hinders right reason from developing. So the person just remains so driven by their passions, but they don't learn how to grow up and to think rationally. And so this is where, like, really the person who is struggling to climb out of addiction is at the same time trying to regrow that part of their mind that had kind of atrophied because of their levels of intemperance. Because temperance is always regulated by right reason, when we're intemperate, we just don't think well. This is why also too, in 12-step programs, and it's fascinating, I read this study that had people who kept on failing out of rehab program. They were at like rehab again and again and again, just repeat, and they were never getting sober. And so this one person actually took some hair follicles and they tested the enzymes in the person. The first couple of weeks of their therapy or recovery was all about just doing blood work and blood tests, trying to get the enzymes in their body equalized and just to a normal level. What they found is a 90% success rate for people who were able to get their enzymes right so that they could think rationally and then go out into the world and resist intemperance or their addiction. This just shows how incredibly important right reason is for the controlling of temperance. Now, the excess of temperance, right? So intemperance is, I guess, if one lacks temperance, right, they're going to be intemperate with everything. The other one is insensibility. That's the other extreme. And this is a person who literally has no passionate desires at all, nor do they ever act on it. So they'd be the classic teetotaler, like no dancing, no gambling, no drinking, no eating sweets, no watching movies, no listening to music, just complete denial of the passions. In our own tradition, we usually call this prudishness, and it's a total denial of what God had said, is that the created order is actually good. And it's a fear, right, of actually going into the difficulty of moderating something with right reason. If a person is insensible, they're actually not able to use the senses appropriately. And the person in this category is really kind of inhuman. And this is where we would kind of experience them as very cold or rigid, like something that's just not enjoyable to be with, or you call them a wet blanket of sorts. To say that what God has given to this world is all across the board evil doesn't make sense. Because if things were given for us to use them with right reason, right, part of the beautiful thing about creation is that God created us in his image and his likeness. And so we have free will and we have right reason. So anytime we're going to pursue a virtue, it's going to exemplify both of those things. And right reason will tell us there are times when you can indulge in the things of the flesh. And so not to be afraid to do that. It's hard to find the medium or the middle road, but it's definitely where we're called to do. The virtue is always in the difficult middle. What is evil and wrong about the passions is not their existence, but when they are not ordered to the good. And this is why, especially in the Catholic tradition, we've always used kind of smells and bells, and we've had festivals and bingo and beer tents and polka and dancing, because we really do see that these things actually help to lift us up to praise of God, rather than necessarily to take them away. The only time where we would fail to praise God in the midst of the senses is when we are controlled by the passions and not able to raise our hearts and our minds up to heaven. So I hope after walking through these 4 temporal virtues, you're able to see the landscape all the more clear and able to truly obtain that life of holiness that we are all called to become.